"Ma'am, the gentleman who made the reservation just called. He said he's changed his mind." The waiter's voice cut through the restaurant like a blade. Every head turned toward the silver-haired woman sitting alone at table 12. Her hands trembled as she reached for her purse, her eyes glistening with humiliation. Mason recognized her immediately, Eleanor, his ex-wife's mother, a woman he'd met only twice in his life. He watched her crumble under the weight of public shame, and something inside him snapped. What he did next would change everything. Mason had not wanted to be here tonight. 3 hours ago, he had been sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the only suit he owned, a navy blue piece he had bought for his mother's funeral 8 years ago. The fabric had faded at the elbows, and the pants were a little too tight around the waist now, but it was all he had. His best friend Derek had practically dragged him into this blind date. 6 years Mason. Derek had said, leaning against the doorframe of Mason's small apartment. 6 years since Diana left. Sophie needs a woman in her life, and you need to start living again. Mason had wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Not when his 8-year-old daughter had looked up at him that morning with those big brown eyes and asked, "Daddy, are you going to find someone nice tonight?" So here he was, sitting alone at a corner table in a restaurant he couldn't afford, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, waiting for a woman who would never show up. The text message had arrived 30 minutes after his reservation time. "Sorry, I can't make it. Good luck." No explanation. No apology beyond that single hollow word. Mason had read it twice, then slipped his phone back into his pocket. He wasn't surprised. He had stopped being surprised by rejection years ago. Diana had taught him that lesson well. His ex-wife had left on a Tuesday morning 6 years ago. She had packed 2 suitcases while Sophie was at daycare, and Mason was underneath someone's kitchen sink fixing a garbage disposal for $12 an hour. By the time he came home, she was gone. The note she left was brief. "I can't do this anymore. I deserve more." 3 months later, she married Richard Ashford, a real estate developer worth more money than Mason would earn in 10 lifetimes. She moved to a mansion in Connecticut, traded her last name, and slowly erased her old life. The birthday cards she sent Sophie became shorter each year until last year, when she forgot entirely. Mason never spoke ill of Diana in front of their daughter. But every night when Sophie asked why Mommy didn't call, he felt something inside him crack a little more. He was about to signal the waiter for his check when he noticed the woman at table 12. She sat alone, her silver hair styled elegantly, her makeup applied with careful precision. A string of pearls hung around her neck, and her hands adorned with rings that caught the candlelight rested on the white tablecloth. She was clearly waiting for someone, checking her phone every few seconds, adjusting the napkin on her lap. There was something familiar about her face. Then the waiter approached her table, and Mason watched everything fall apart. "Ma'am, the gentleman who made the reservation just called." The waiter's voice carried across the room with careless volume. "He said he's changed his mind. He won't be coming." The restaurant fell silent. Forks stopped mid-air. Conversations died. Every eye in the room turned toward the silver-haired woman at table 12. Mason saw her face crumble. Her lips trembled. Her eyes, which had been bright with anticipation moments ago, now glistened with tears she was fighting to hold back. Her hands shook as she reached for her purse, desperate to escape before the humiliation swallowed her whole. Someone at a nearby table laughed, a soft, cruel sound that cut through the silence. And in that moment, Mason recognized her. Eleanor, his ex-wife's mother. He had met her exactly twice in his life. The first time was at his wedding, where she had shaken his hand politely but distantly. The second time was at Sophie's christening, when she had held her granddaughter for exactly 5 minutes before handing her back to Diana. She lived in another state, and Diana had never been close with her mother. After the divorce, Eleanor had simply vanished from their lives. Another thread cut, another connection severed. Mason didn't know anything about this woman. He didn't know that her husband of 35 years had left her for his secretary 6 months ago. He didn't know that Diana had stopped returning her calls after marrying Richard, embarrassed by a mother who didn't fit into her new social circle. He didn't know that tonight was supposed to be Eleanor's first step back into the world after months of isolation and grief. All Mason knew was what he saw a woman being destroyed by public shame, and suddenly he was 27 years old again. The memory hit him like a wave. His mother standing in the checkout line at a grocery store, her wallet open, her face burning with embarrassment. She had miscounted her money. The total was $47 and she only had $32. The cashier had announced this loudly, impatiently, as if his mother were wasting everyone's time. "Ma'am, you need to put something back. You don't have enough." The people in line behind them had stared, some with pity, some with annoyance. One woman had actually sighed and checked her watch, as if Mason's mother, a woman who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, was an inconvenience to her schedule. Mason had stood there frozen, useless. He was a grown man, but he didn't have money. He didn't have power. He didn't have anything except the helpless rage burning in his chest as he watched his mother shrink before his eyes. She had put back the chicken, then the bread, then the eggs. She left with a single bag of rice and a gallon of milk, her head bowed, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. His mother never fully recovered from that day. Something in her had broken some essential dignity that she never quite reclaimed. She died 3 years later, and Mason had always believed that her heart gave out not because of illness, but because she had simply stopped believing she was worth saving. Now, 8 years after her funeral, he watched another woman face the same destruction. Eleanor was fumbling with her purse, trying to pull out cash to pay for a meal she hadn't even eaten. The waiter stood there impatiently, and the other diners had resumed their conversations, but Mason could see them stealing glances, whispering, judging. He thought about leaving. It would be the smart thing to do. Eleanor was practically a stranger. She was his ex-wife's mother, a connection to a past he wanted to forget. Getting involved would be complicated, messy, potentially disastrous. But then he remembered Sophie's voice from that morning. "Daddy, are you going to find someone nice tonight?" Mason wasn't a man who believed in signs, but in that moment, he understood something with perfect clarity. If he walked away now, he would never be able to look his daughter in the eye again. He would become the same frozen man who had watched his mother be humiliated and done nothing. He reached into his jacket pocket and felt the small velvet box. The ring inside had belonged to his mother, a modest diamond she had worn for 30 years before passing it to Mason on her deathbed. "Give this to someone who deserves to be loved," she had whispered. He had carried it with him tonight because Derek had insisted this blind date might be different, might be the start of something real. It wasn't much, but it was everything he had. Mason stood up. His legs carried him across the restaurant before his mind could catch up. He moved past the bar, past the curious stares, past the table where someone was still chuckling at Eleanor's misfortune. His heart pounded against his ribs and his hands were trembling, but he didn't stop. He reached table 12 and sat down across from Eleanor. She looked up startled. For a moment, confusion clouded her face. Who was this man? Then recognition flickered in her eyes. Her lips parted, but no words came out. "Sorry I'm late, sweetheart." Mason spoke loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear. Traffic was absolutely terrible. Eleanor's eyes widened. She opened her mouth to speak, but Mason reached across the table and took her hand in his. "I know we talked about waiting." He continued, his voice steady even as his heart raced. "But I can't wait anymore. I've been thinking about this all day and I realized life is too short." Before Eleanor could respond, before she could ask what he was doing, before the confused whispers around them could turn into questions, Mason pulled the velvet box from his pocket. He lowered himself to one knee beside her chair. The restaurant went silent again, but this time the silence was different. This time it was filled with anticipation, with held breath, with the electric charge of a moment everyone wanted to witness. "Eleanor," Mason said, opening the box to reveal the small diamond ring. "I've waited so long for this. Will you marry me?" Eleanor stared at him. Her eyes were still wet with the tears of humiliation, but something else was forming there now, shock, disbelief, and something that might have been gratitude. Her mouth opened and closed. She looked at the ring, then at his face, then at the dozens of people watching them. She understood. He could see it in her eyes. She understood that this was a rescue, not a proposal. She understood that this stranger, this man, she barely knew her daughter's ex-husband, was offering her a way out of her shame. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes, I'll marry you." The restaurant erupted. Applause filled the room. People cheered. Phones appeared in hands recording the moment. The waiter who had humiliated Eleanor moments ago was now beaming, congratulating them, offering champagne on the house. Mason slipped the ring onto Eleanor's finger. It was slightly too big, but neither of them mentioned it. He stood, and she stood with him, and for the benefit of their audience, she wrapped her arms around him in an embrace. "Thank you," she breathed into his ear so quietly that only he could hear. "I don't know why you did this, but thank you." Mason held her, this woman he barely knew, this mother of the woman who had shattered his life. And he whispered back the only honest answer he had, "Because someone should have done it for my mother, and no one did." The video appeared on the internet the next morning. Someone at the restaurant had captured everything: the proposal, the ring, the applause, the embrace. They had uploaded it with a caption that read, "True love doesn't care about age. This man proposed to his girlfriend at La Maison last night, and I'm literally crying." Within 48 hours, the video had been viewed over 2 million times. Local news stations picked up the story. Strangers on the internet called it the most romantic thing they'd ever seen. Comments flooded in from around the country, praising the handsome black man who had swept an elegant older woman off her feet. Mason watched the video spread with growing dread. He had not anticipated this. He had expected to save Eleanor from one night of humiliation, then quietly disappear back into his life. Instead, he had created a spectacle that now demanded an explanation and a continuation. Eleanor called him 3 days after the restaurant. "We need to talk," she said, her voice strained. "I'm coming to your apartment." Mason gave her the address reluctantly. He had not told Derek or Sophie about what had happened. He had hidden his phone every time the notifications exploded. He had hoped foolishly that the whole thing would simply blow over. But when Eleanor knocked on his door that Saturday afternoon, he understood that nothing about this situation would be simple. She looked different in daylight, older somehow, but also more real. At the restaurant, she had been a vision of elegant desperation. Now standing in the hallway of his modest apartment building, she was just a woman in a cardigan and slacks. Her silver hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face bare of makeup. "I came to thank you properly," Eleanor said when he opened the door. "And to tell you that we should end this. I'll release a statement saying we broke off the engagement. You don't have to be involved anymore." Mason nodded. It was the sensible plan, the only plan that made sense. Then Sophie appeared behind him. "Daddy, who's at the door?" Mason turned to find his daughter standing in the hallway, her hair still messy from her afternoon nap, her favorite stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest. She peered around him at the stranger in their doorway. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. 8 years. It had been 8 years since she had seen this child. The last time Sophie had been a baby in a christening gown, small enough to fit in the crook of Eleanor's arm. Now she was a little girl with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, looking up at Eleanor with innocent curiosity. "Hi there," Eleanor managed her voice, suddenly thick. Sophie studied her for a moment, then she looked up at Mason with a question in her eyes. "Daddy, is this your girlfriend? The one from the video Derek showed me on his phone?" Mason didn't know what to say. He looked at Eleanor, and Eleanor looked at him, and in that suspended moment, neither of them could find the right words. But Sophie wasn't finished. She stepped past her father and extended her hand toward Eleanor, just as Mason had taught her to do when meeting adults. "I'm Sophie," she announced. "Are you going to be my new mommy?" Eleanor took the small hand in hers. Her eyes were glistening, and Mason could see her struggling to maintain composure. This was her granddaughter, her own flesh and blood, and yet they were meeting like strangers. "I don't know yet, sweetheart," Eleanor answered softly, "but I'd like to be your friend if that's okay." Sophie considered this offer with the seriousness only a child could muster. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied. "Okay. Do you want to see my room? I have a goldfish named Bubbles." She grabbed Eleanor's hand and pulled her inside without waiting for permission. Mason stood in the doorway watching his daughter drag his ex-wife's mother down the narrow hallway and realized that their simple plan had just become infinitely more complicated. That afternoon changed everything. Eleanor stayed for dinner. She helped Sophie color in a princess book. She listened to the little girl's stories about school and friends, and the mean boy named Tommy who pulled her hair during recess. And when Sophie fell asleep on the couch with her head in Eleanor's lap, something shifted in the older woman's face, softening a crack in the careful walls she had built around herself. "I missed everything," Eleanor whispered, looking down at her sleeping granddaughter. "Diana never brought her to visit. She said the drive was too long, that Sophie got carsick, that there was never a good time. And I believed her. I let years go by because I believed her excuses." Mason sat across from them, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. "Diana's good at excuses," he said quietly. "She told me I wasn't enough for her, that I couldn't give her the life she deserved, and I believed that too." Eleanor looked up at him. "What happened, if you don't mind my asking?" So Mason told her. He told her about the Tuesday morning when he came home to an empty apartment and a note on the kitchen table. He told her about the months of wondering what he had done wrong, the years of explaining to Sophie why Mommy lived in a different house, now the endless cycle of hope and disappointment every time a birthday card arrived, and the crushing silence when they stopped coming altogether. And Eleanor, in turn, told him her story. 35 years of marriage to a man who had smiled at her every morning and built a secret life behind her back. The humiliation of discovering his affair through a credit card statement hotel, charges, jewelry purchases, all for a woman 20 years younger. The divorce that had stripped her of everything except her dignity, and then the slow, awful realization that her own daughter was ashamed of her. "Diana stopped returning my calls after she married Richard," Eleanor said. "I think she didn't want me around. I wasn't sophisticated enough. My clothes were wrong. My house was too small. I was a reminder of the life she was trying to escape." Mason understood then that he and Eleanor were not so different. They were both casualties of the same storm, both left behind by people who had decided they weren't worth keeping. "Maybe we shouldn't end this yet," he said slowly. "The engagement, I mean." Eleanor frowned. "What are you saying?" Mason looked at Sophie, still asleep, her small chest rising and falling with each breath. "She needs family," he said. "Real family. And you want a chance to know her. If we end this now, there's no reason for you to stay. Diana will find out we lied, and she'll make sure you never see Sophie again. But if we keep up the act for a while longer, you can spend time with her. Get to know her. Be her grandmother." It was a crazy plan. They both knew it. But Eleanor looked at the child in her lap, this grandchild she had lost to distance and deception, and she nodded. "A few months," she agreed. "Just until things settle down. Then we'll figure out how to end it gracefully." Neither of them believed that timeline would hold. The weeks that followed were strange and unexpected. Eleanor began picking Sophie up from school twice a week. She taught the little girl how to bake cookies and fold origami cranes. She sat through countless tea parties with stuffed animals and listened to dramatic readings of picture books. and slowly, carefully, she began to fill a space in Sophie's life that had been empty for too long. Mason watched this transformation with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. He had not expected Eleanor to take to her grandmother role so naturally. He had not expected Sophie to attach herself so fiercely to this woman she barely knew. And he certainly had not expected the quiet evenings when Eleanor would stay after Sophie went to bed, sitting on his small porch, sharing stories about their failed marriages and broken dreams. One night, after a particularly long conversation about regret and second chances, Eleanor turned to him with tears in her eyes. "No one has ever done what you did for me at that restaurant," she said. "My whole life I've been the one who saved others. I was the one who held my marriage together. I was the one who supported Diana through every crisis. And when I needed saving, everyone disappeared." Mason didn't know how to respond. He looked out at the small patch of grass that passed for his backyard and thought about his mother, about all the times she had needed saving and no one had come. "I didn't save you," he finally said. "I just did what someone should have done for my mother a long time ago. I did it for her. And maybe for myself, too." Eleanor reached over and took his hand. It was a simple gesture without romance or expectation. Just two people who had been broken by the world holding on to each other because they finally understood that they didn't have to be alone. Then Diana came home. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon, pulling up to Mason's apartment in a black Mercedes that looked obscenely expensive, parked on his crumbling street. Mason was at work, but Eleanor was there helping Sophie with her homework at the kitchen table. The knock on the door was sharp, impatient. When Eleanor opened it, her daughter stood on the other side, and the look on Diana's face could have frozen water. "Mother!" The word came out like an accusation. "What are you doing here?" Before Eleanor could answer, Sophie came running from the kitchen. "Grandma, who is it? Is Daddy home?" She stopped short when she saw Diana, 8 years old, and she didn't recognize her own mother. She looked at the beautiful woman in the designer dress and expensive heels, then looked back at Eleanor with confusion. "Grandma, who is that lady?" Diana's face twisted. Something ugly flickered in her eyes, not pain, but wounded pride. "I'm your mother, Sophie." Her voice was tight. "Don't you remember me?" Sophie shrank back against Eleanor's leg. "I want Daddy," she whispered. "Grandma, I want Daddy to come home." It was that word grandma that seemed to break something in Diana. She turned on Eleanor with fury burning in her gaze. "Mother, what have you done? What is this sick game you're playing? Diana, let's talk about this calmly, calmly." Diana pushed past her mother into the apartment, looking around at the small living room, the worn furniture, the evidence of a life lived on a plumber's salary. "You're living here with him, the man I divorced because he couldn't provide for his own family." Eleanor straightened her spine. "I'm not living here. I'm spending time with my granddaughter, something I should have done years ago. Don't you dare put this on me." Diana's voice rose. "I built a life for myself. I got out of poverty. I made something of myself. And now you're throwing it all away to play house with my ex-husband." Sophie began to cry. Eleanor knelt down and pulled the child into her arms, shielding her from her mother's anger. "Diana, stop. You're scaring her." "I'm her mother. I have every right to." "You haven't been her mother in 6 years. Eleanor's voice was quiet but firm. "You left her. You forgot her birthdays. You never called. And now you come back and expect her to run into your arms." Diana stared at her mother as if seeing a stranger. Then her expression hardened. "This isn't over," she said. "I know about the proposal, I know about the video, and I know it's all fake." Eleanor felt her blood run cold. "That's right." Diana smiled without warmth. "I made some calls. The restaurant the night of your engagement, I found out the truth. You were there for a blind date that went wrong. He saved you from embarrassment. And then you both decided to keep lying to everyone." Sophie was trembling against Eleanor's chest, and Eleanor held her tighter. "If you expose this," Eleanor said carefully, "you'll hurt Sophie." She's already confused. She already doesn't understand why her mother abandoned her. Do you really want to add more pain? Diana's eyes narrowed. Don't lecture me about pain, Mother. I'm not the one who's been lying to the whole world. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to end this charade, publicly apologize for deceiving everyone, and come back home with me. We'll tell people you had a mental breakdown after the divorce. It will be embarrassing, but we can recover. And if I don't, then I'll make sure you never see Sophie again. I'll sue Mason for custody. I'll tell every court in this country that he manipulated a vulnerable older woman as part of some twisted revenge scheme. And when I'm done, he'll lose everything. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Diana was serious. She had the money, the lawyers, the connections to make good on her threat. Mason would be destroyed. Sophie would be taken away. Everything they had built over these past weeks would crumble to dust. Diana turned to leave, then stopped at the door. You have 1 week, Mother. Choose wisely. She was gone before Eleanor could respond. That night when Mason came home, Eleanor was waiting for him on the porch. Her face was pale. Her hands were shaking, and when she told him everything Diana had said, Mason felt his heart sink. Maybe we should stop, he said quietly. It's not worth it. Your relationship with Diana, my custody of Sophie, there's too much at stake. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. I've spent 62 years living for other people, she said. My husband, my daughter, society. I've done everything right, everything I was supposed to do, and what did I get? Abandoned, betrayed, forgotten. She took a shaky breath. I don't know what happens next, Mason, but I do know that I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of sacrificing myself for people who don't sacrifice anything for me. Mason reached over and took her hand just as she had taken his weeks ago. Whatever we decide, he said, we decide together. The night before Diana's deadline, Mason sat on the edge of Sophie's bed and watched his daughter sleep. She had been quiet all week. She didn't understand why Grandma Eleanor had stopped coming over or why Daddy spent so much time on the phone with worried voices. She only knew that something was wrong and that the adults in her life were keeping secrets from her. Mason brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and felt his heart break. He had tried so hard to protect her. After Diana left, he had worked double shifts to make sure Sophie never went without. He had learned to braid hair from YouTube videos. He had sat through school plays and parent-teacher conferences and endless questions about why Mommy didn't live with them anymore. He had built a life from the wreckage of his marriage, and he had done it all for this little girl. Now he was about to lose everything. A soft knock came from the front door. Mason found Eleanor standing on his porch, her coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders against the autumn chill. Her eyes were red, but her jaw was set with determination. I've made a decision, she said before he could speak. I'm not going to let Diana control my life anymore. Mason stepped aside to let her in. They sat together on his worn couch, speaking in whispers so they wouldn't wake Sophie. I've spent 62 years making myself small, Eleanor continued, shrinking to fit into spaces other people made for me. My husband wanted a quiet wife, so I was quiet. Diana wanted a mother who stayed out of her way, so I stayed out of her way. And where did it get me? Alone, abandoned, watching my granddaughter from the outside of a window. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. I called Channel 7 News this morning. I told them I wanted to do an interview. I told them the whole story, the truth about the proposal, about why you did it, about everything that happened after. Mason felt the blood drain from his face. Eleanor, if you do this, Diana will be furious, I know. Eleanor's voice was steady. But I'm done being afraid of my daughter's anger. I'm done sacrificing my happiness to protect her image. For the first time in my life, I want to tell my own story, and I want you to tell yours. The interview aired 2 days later. Mason and Eleanor sat side by side on a small studio couch, facing a reporter named Sandra Collins, who had promised to let them speak without interruption. The cameras rolled, and Mason felt his palms grow slick with sweat. But Eleanor squeezed his hand once, and he found his courage. They told the truth. All of it. Eleanor explained about her blind date, the humiliation of being publicly rejected the moment when a stranger sat down across from her and pretended to be someone he wasn't. Mason explained why he did it. He talked about his mother, about the grocery store, about the cashier's cruel voice, about standing frozen, while his mother shrank before his eyes. He talked about watching Eleanor face the same destruction and knowing he couldn't walk away. "I didn't plan any of this," Mason said, looking directly into the camera. "I went to that restaurant for a blind date of my own. I got stood up too. And when I saw Eleanor sitting there, I saw my mother. I saw every person who has ever been made to feel small and worthless because they couldn't afford dignity." Sandra Collins leaned forward. "But you did propose to her. You did put a ring on her finger. Wasn't that deceptive?" "It was," Mason admitted. "And I'm not proud of the lie. But I'm proud that I didn't walk away. I'm proud that for once in my life I did something instead of standing there feeling helpless." Eleanor spoke next. She talked about her marriage, about 35 years of devotion repaid with betrayal. She talked about her daughter's slow withdrawal, the phone calls that stopped coming, the grandchild she was never allowed to know. "Diana is ashamed of me," Eleanor said quietly. "She's ashamed of where she came from. And I understand that shame, I've felt it too my whole life. But I'm tired of being ashamed. I'm tired of apologizing for existing." The interview was almost over when the studio door burst open. Sophie came running across the floor, Derek chasing behind her with an apologetic expression. The little girl had been waiting in the green room, but she had heard her father's voice through the speakers and couldn't stay away. "Daddy?" She climbed onto the couch between Mason and Eleanor, her stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest. "Daddy, why are you on TV?" Sandra Collins looked uncertain, but she didn't stop recording. Sophie turned to face the camera with the fearless confidence only a child could possess. "My grandma is the best grandma ever," she announced. "She makes cookies with me. She reads me stories. She never forgets my name." Her small voice wavered. "My other mommy forgot my name. She forgot my birthday. But Grandma Eleanor always remembers." She looked up at Eleanor with fierce, protective love. "Don't let anyone be mean to my grandma. She's mine now." The interview ended shortly after. But that moment, Sophie's declaration, her tiny body wedged between the two people she loved most, became the image that defined the story. In the weeks that followed, public opinion shifted. The comments that had once questioned Mason's motives now praised his compassion. Women wrote in to share their own stories of public humiliation, of being made to feel worthless, of wishing someone had been there to save them. Men wrote about their mothers, their grandmothers, the women they had failed to protect. Diana's threat of exposure had backfired. The truth was out, but the truth had set them free. 3 days after the interview, Diana came to see her mother. Eleanor was alone in Mason's apartment folding laundry while Sophie was at school. She heard the knock and knew immediately who it was. Diana never knocked gently. Mother and daughter stood facing each other in the small living room, and for a long moment neither spoke. "You chose them over me." Diana's voice was flat, controlled. "Your own daughter, and you chose them." Eleanor set down the shirt she had been folding. "I chose myself, Diana. For the first time in 62 years, I chose myself. And what about me? What about everything I've done to build a life, to make something of myself? You've embarrassed me in front of everyone." Eleanor looked at her daughter, this woman she had raised, had sacrificed for, had loved despite everything, and felt something shift inside her. "You left your daughter," Eleanor said quietly. "You left a 2-year-old child and never looked back. You married a man with money and decided that Sophie was an inconvenience. You stopped calling me because I didn't fit into your new life. And now you stand here asking me to feel sorry for your embarrassment." Diana's composure cracked. Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment she looked like the little girl Eleanor remembered, vulnerable, uncertain, desperate for approval. "I was trying to survive, Mother. I was trying to escape." "I know." Eleanor's voice softened. "I know you were running from poverty, from struggle, from everything you feared. But you can't run forever, Diana. And you can't keep hurting people who love you because you're afraid of where you came from." Diana wiped her eyes. "So what now? We're just done." Eleanor crossed the room and took her daughter's hands in hers. "The door is always open," she said. "But you have to walk through it yourself. I won't chase you anymore. I won't beg for your attention or your approval. If you want to be part of this family, Sophie's family, you're welcome. But it has to be your choice." Diana pulled away. She looked around the apartment one more time, taking in the modest furniture, the crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, the evidence of a life built on love instead of wealth. Then she left without another word. Eleanor watched her go and felt something release in her chest. Not closure exactly, that would take years if it ever came at all, but acceptance. She had said what needed to be said. The rest was up to Diana. 6 months later, spring arrived early. Mason had saved every spare dollar he earned, skipping lunches and working extra jobs on weekends. The ring he bought wasn't expensive, a simple band with a small diamond that sparkled in the light, but it had cost him 6 months of sacrifice, and that made it priceless. Sophie's 9th birthday fell on a Saturday. Eleanor baked a cake with purple frosting, Sophie's favorite color. Derek came over with balloons and a wrapped present that turned out to be a new stuffed rabbit to keep Bubbles company. The apartment was small, the decorations were handmade, and the food was simple. It was perfect. After Sophie blew out her candles and opened her presents, Mason stood up from the table. His hands were trembling, but his voice was steady. "Sophie, sweetheart, I need to ask Grandma Eleanor something. Is that okay?" Sophie nodded eagerly, her eyes already wide with anticipation. Mason turned to Eleanor and lowered himself to one knee. "The first time I did this," he said, "it was to save you from embarrassment. I didn't know you. I didn't love you. I was just a man trying to do what someone should have done for my mother." He pulled out the ring box and opened it. "This time is different. This time I'm asking because I want to spend the rest of my life with you, because you showed my daughter what a grandmother's love looks like, because you showed me that broken people can build something beautiful together." Eleanor's eyes were streaming with tears, but she was smiling. "Eleanor, will you marry me for real this time?" She nodded, unable to speak. Mason slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly this time, and Sophie launched herself at both of them, wrapping her small arms around their necks. "We're a family now," she shouted. "A real family." Mason held them both close, his daughter, his future wife, and thought about his mother. He hoped she could see him now. He hoped she knew that her son had finally learned how to save someone, and in saving Eleanor, he had saved himself.